All right, welcome, welcome. I'm the dramatic historian, and today we are fortunate to have Dr. Brooks Simpson on the channel. He is a history professor at Arizona State University and has authored more than 25 books, ranging from solo authorship to co authorship and editing. Yet he is best known for his work on Ulysses S. Grant and is the definitive scholar on Grant's life, and of course, my humble opinion. But however, today we are going to focus on one of his latest edited works, Reconstruction: Voices from America's First Great Struggle for Racial Equality. So let's get into it. Well, I want to start off with a quote from Woodrow Wilson. So you probably already know where this is going. But he delivered this message almost 40 years after Reconstruction, where he described it as a veritable overthrow of civilization in the South and their determination to put the white South under the heel of the black South. So, for much of the 20th century, that interpretation dominated popular understanding of Reconstruction. So, how did that narrative become so influential, and why is it proven so difficult to actually dislodge?
It's proven difficult to dislodge largely because of attitudes of racism in American society, and that the assumptions that Wilson and others operated under were the assumptions of large segments of white America, North as well as South. Uh, this reconciliationist narrative also did much to bind up the nation's wounds between Union and Confederate and made Confederates feel good about themselves. This is an active effort to obscure the historical record to serve present day political positions. That was really critical in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
So, then if you had to identify the single greatest misconception then Americans have about Reconstruction, what do you think that actually would be?
I think the argument that African Americans are not able to understand their own best interest or to act as political actors in their own best interest. I think the other thing that Americans tend to overlook is the degree of white supremacist terrorist violence exercised against African Americans and their white allies. That we saw incidents in Reconstruction which, if they occurred today, would shock us. But we either do not know about them or mischaracterize them or ignore them altogether, as we did after 9/11 when we talked about terrorism not being part of American history. It certainly was a part of American history during Reconstruction. So both the ability of African Americans to look out for their own interests and to define those own interests, which a lot of people, for various reasons, discounted, and the role of white supremacist violence in overthrowing Reconstruction has been minimalized in many of our historical accounts.
Do you think that Reconstruction is simply a continuation of the Civil War? I mean, as you already mentioned, the violence that we see is, I mean, it's unprecedented. And whether it's terrorist related or battles, I mean, the reality is it's still an attempt to seek peace or bring this view of civil rights to the forefront.
It's hard to say that because the American Civil War was not a war for black civil rights. That was a product of that war, but that was not the reason the war was fought. I think from the point of view of white Southerners, however, white Southerners who were not willing to give their all to secure Confederate independence were willing to act in a far more unified and a vibrant way, frankly, to preserve white supremacy. That's something that could reunite the Confederacy. To this day, we have an image of the Confederacy as this united entity, which it was not. Reconstruction united those white Southerners in a way that, frankly, the Civil War did not. They were willing to fight the guerrilla war to secure white supremacy that they were unwilling to fight to secure Confederate independence.
So, why do you think then Reconstruction remains less understood than the Civil War? Is it simply does it have to do more with the terms of it gets much more into the political arguments of the time, in which I feel that the interest of the Civil War largely remains around kind of the military history and everything else.
Well, first of all, if you remember the typical American survey course taught at high schools and colleges, it breaks at Reconstruction, and often teachers don't have enough time to cover it or do not cover it because they're not interested. And then the second half of that survey doesn't tend to cover Reconstruction in much depth. So, first of all, is in how we teach it at this point. It's the breaking point of the course. And a lot of people minimize its importance for various reasons, how much time they've taken with other topics, other interests, etc. It's also a very unpleasant time in American history. To focus on this racial tension and violence doesn't fit well with how we view the American Civil War. Very violent, but we surround that with glory. Imagine, if you will, if you were Jim McPherson and you ended Battle Cry of Freedom in 1877 rather than 1865. It's a different story. It's not the triumphant narrative that McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom talks about. We don't see that Reconstruction defines what the Civil War achieves and what it does not achieve. We tend to concentrate on those battles, those heroes, those military actions, etc., in part because that's a heroic narrative in the minds of many people who tell it. Whereas we don't have the same interest in telling a narrative of struggle and failure, frankly, that uh, reveals other aspects of the American character we might not want to focus on.
And I can only speak to Kansas here, but I teach American history starting post Civil War, and you're exactly right. It's very odd. We actually start with, Rockefeller. We start with all these big industrialists, and we just kind of skip over Reconstruction, largely due to issues of time constraints, as you mentioned previously. But when I do throw out the word Reconstruction, most of the time my students think it's just they're building something. But to get more into the book itself, one of the really impressive things about this book that I really like is that you break up this book into three different sections. And within these sections, you're using a variety of different primary sources to build your story. And when you were writing this book, how did you decide to use certain speeches and conversations of the people within it? So, how did you actually go about organizing it or addressing the major themes of it?
Well, I think that the point is that every documentary collection is selective, and most of them do explicitly or implicitly tell a story. This one was, what did the Civil War achieve and what did it not achieve? And it does focus on reuniting the country, but addressing what does freedom mean for African Americans and what is white America willing to do to secure those opportunities, those liberties, those rights, those freedoms. So you pick documents which offer rather vivid examples of what you're talking about. For example, there's a document out there from October 1865. It's Andrew Johnson addressing African American veterans. Now, I want you to think about this in terms of a president of the United States addressing veterans fresh from military service. Johnson treats the soldiers in front of him in a very disparaging way. You would never imagine an American president speaking to veterans that way. But I wanted to show the animus that the president of the United States had towards African Americans by showing how we treat those who fought the service of their country. And he basically says, you better get your act together. You better unite your families. You better live a moral life so you'll be extinguished. Those are strong words to come from any president towards a population that's fought for the defense of of the United States.
I'm going to a lot of the questions I'm going to ask you are going to focus on three personalities that come up quite a bit throughout Reconstruction. One of them is Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson is very different than his predecessor. And you make that very clear, even when he addresses those veterans. So he is just a little bit of background for our listeners. President Johnson, he was the vice president of Abraham Lincoln. He's sworn in following Lincoln's assassination on April 15th, 1865. How did his views align with Lincoln's, but how did it also differ in terms of the policies of Reconstruction?
Well, what Johnson does is try to do what many Americans have done, clothe himself around the Lincoln aura and say, my proclamations aren't that different than Lincoln's, although they were issued at a far different time. That's what people don't understand. Lincoln's Reconstruction policy is a wartime policy. It's designed to weaken support for the Confederacy. It's designed to give an easy way for Confederate dissenters to come back into the Union. As such, Lincoln realizes that with the end of the war, with the surrender at Appomattox and the capitulation of other Confederate forces, those ends no longer need to be met. And now there's a question of how are we going to structure restoring civil government and protecting Black rights? He doesn't know. And he's cut down before he's figured it out. This idea of what would Lincoln have done during Reconstruction is really about us. It's not about Abraham Lincoln, because there's not a lot of evidence what Lincoln would have done, because Lincoln didn't know. Johnson was committed to white supremacy. In fact, many white Southerners, after they understood that Johnson was not going to stand by his initial pledges of punishing treason and traitors, they told Johnson, you understand the world we live in. You understand the importance of maintaining white supremacy. Johnson, being a Jacksonian Democrat by heritage, also believed in the rather vigorous exercise of presidential power. And that was most notable in his veto messages, which were straightforward appeals to American racism, and argued that all the Reconstruction legislation being proposed by congressional Republicans was essentially affirmative action legislation. If you read those vetoes, you will see echoes of current debates over affirmative action in them. So, Johnson he says there's no such thing as Reconstruction, it's restoration. I'm bringing the Union back together. And he believed that the only way to placate white Southerners was to do something that he actually believed in, which was to honor their prejudices towards African Americans and to make sure that African Americans remained a subordinate part of the American population. So that's what Johnson wants. He wants a quick and easy Reconstruction that has minimal impact upon Southern society.
I want to talk a little bit more about this veto message because I found that one, I thought it really stood out among the others. And the veto message is framed almost entirely as a constitutional argument. It's clearly racial, but he's arguing on the basis of the Constitution. So how should historians then evaluate Johnson's constitutional reasoning alongside the racial assumptions embedded throughout the document?
The Constitution provides a vocabulary as well as a process to address problems. Johnson was a master of the vocabulary of Reconstruction and the vocabulary of the Constitution. So he does that rather well. He offers a very conservative view of the Constitution. Johnson would always justify his measures as being constitutionally sound. And yet Johnson himself, his original Reconstruction plan, has nothing to do with the Constitution and involves the exercise of presidential powers not outlined in the document. There's nothing in the Constitution that provides for the situation Americans faced in 1865. But by giving that framework, and much like Lincoln did, of my measures are justified by my interpretation of the Constitution, conservative scholars who hewed towards constitutional interpretation tended to see in Johnson a bulwark of constitutional interpretation. And in fact, Johnson's battling over the Constitution has recently been invoked by the United States Supreme Court. So Johnson's conservatism continues to reverberate, and it's how you interpret the Constitution. It's a very malleable document. But Johnson is very clear that he believes he's going to cloak himself not only around the Lincoln legacy, but also himself as defender of constitutional rights, a constitution which was not framed with Black equality in mind.
So I guess that begs the question then, was Reconstruction as much about competing visions of federalism as it was about race?
Well, to some degree, people invoke competing visions of federalism, but I don't think they're thinking quite in terms of refounding the republic. They end up having to do that with the passage of 3 constitutional amendments, which significantly change the relationship of the national government to its citizens. But I don't think they thought of themselves in the beginning as a second founding generation. They saw themselves as looking for protection under law for equality. They also had learned from the American Civil War that an overemphasis on states' rights led to local abuses, and that there had to be some guarantees for a definition of American citizenship. And that is where the 14th Amendment becomes important, as well as the clauses in the 13th and the 15th Amendment authorizing Congress to act to make sure that the promises in those amendments are realized. So that's a justification of congressional activity. And again, the Constitution, these are constitutional amendments, so when they're ratified, they become part of the original document, so to speak, the document, the touchstone of American politics.
Well, and that's clearly very relevant after some court hearings that have been going on in recent news. But another personality that really sticks out in your work is Frederick Douglass. He really, really comes to the forefront here. And again, just a little bit of background here. He was a formerly enslaved person, successfully escaped slavery, recruited soldiers during the war efforts, civil rights advocate. He had a lot of titles. But I believe in his comments on Reconstruction, it was here that Douglass actually argued that state control over local affairs invalidated human rights. So, how much of an appetite did congressional moderates actually have for dismantling state rights in late 1866?
Not that much. I mean, that's one of the fairy tales of Reconstruction, that Reconstruction was dominated by a group of politicians known as the Radical Republicans. It's not true. The legislation that was passed was ideally suited to the interests of moderate Republicans. It seemed radical in an American context, but radical Republicans are actually not satisfied with the actual measures that the Republican-controlled Congress passed. They would have wanted much more extreme measures. I think moderate Republicans were more worried about state inaction and Southern behavior. What we tend to forget is Congress doesn't meet until December 1865. Surrenders Appomattox and Durham Station are in April 1865. The capture of Jefferson Davis is in May. And so the Confederacy is gone. Right? And what they begin to realize is that white Southerners aren't going to act like they're defeated, that they're going to be continually recalcitrant. and resisting of the consequences of United States victory. And that includes trying to subordinate African Americans in violent and unjust ways, violating basic principles of equality before the law. We're not even talking about people necessarily embracing notions of racial equality, but we are talking about people saying that everyone should enjoy the equal protection of the law and equality before the law. And there's rather resilient white supremacist attitude of white Southerners when they have everything to their own. Violence starts long before Republican legislation. One of the arguments of the old interpretations of Reconstruction is that Southern white supremacist violence is merely a reaction to Republican measures, and that's not true. That's factually not true. The violence is there. The violence continues in 1866 in significant ways at places like Memphis, Norfolk, and New Orleans before the Republican program is out there, fully fleshed out, all the legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 is a measure dealing with state inaction, a state's failure to provide colorblind justice before the law. It only justifies federal intervention when it can be demonstrated that a state has failed to protect its citizens. So is really a very moderate, cautious approach that respects federalism in the program of moderate Republicans.
In a debate with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Douglas he's debating about two different items. One is the immediacy of universal suffrage for Black citizens and the immediacy for universal suffrage of women. And he's essentially saying at first that, we need to primarily focus on Black citizens because of the violence, as you've already mentioned. It's that you have this white supremacist that it's the reaction to these proposals. So at one point, Douglas laments that the massacres occur in the very presence of federal soldiers. So how does this actually highlight the structural limits of small peacetime army fighting local terrorism?
Well, the fact is that after the American Civil War, the United States Army shrinks. It was basically a volunteer army. There's an effort to devise a stronger and larger regular army in 1866. But the sort of military occupation presence that would be required to enforce Reconstruction simply wasn't envisioned. It was a lot to demand because of the staunchness of Southern white supremacy and its manifestations in violent acts. Douglas's other problem with that he's trying to address in that speech is very simply that he's basically suggesting that don't ask for too much, don't have women's suffrage, the opposition to women's suffrage, which would strike at every man's beliefs in the inferiority of women, be so strong as to destroy our experiment in democracy for African American males. He's actually, for one time in his career, arguing strongly for political pragmatism, one step at a time. He's not opposed to women's suffrage. He's opposed to women's suffrage being used at the same time because he believes that will defeat his objective of Black male suffrage. And he understands that opponents of Black suffrage like to unite those things together because they think there's a greater animus. So, again, redefining citizenship in the 1860s is a big thing. It's something that the 14th Amendment undertakes. And yet there are questions about immigrants and women and other people that continue to be issues in the present day.
I want to ask about something that actually I didn't have planned, but I listened to Gary Gallagher give a talk about Reconstruction in the South and federal soldiers occupying certain cities. But he makes this point that the number of soldiers, and you touched on this, was extremely small. I mean, it's not like they had, thousands of soldiers marching in different places. Why was the Southern reaction more towards the policies than the actual presence of federal soldiers that made them so angry?
Well, first of all, you have to remember that in 1865, many of the federal soldiers on occupation duty in the Reconstruction South were African American soldiers. That's something that your summary doesn't admit to. And for a white Southerner to see a black person with a weapon was a nightmare scenario. And to see that person protect the rights of other freed people around them was also a nightmare scenario. This notion of black assertiveness was something that white Southerners were astonished by. Many white Southern slave owners, for example, in their diaries bemoaned the ingratitude of their former slaves and how they weren't expecting this sort of behavior. And of course, now, since the formerly enslaved people are human beings who have no economic value to enslavers, they can be vulnerable to violence. You're not killing property anymore. You're just killing human beings. And for some reason, white Southerners are really big about the destruction of property. Notice their obsession with Sherman and various cities going with flames. They're not really obsessed so much about the destruction of human beings. You can see this argument when they try to blame Sherman for the destruction during his marches, but excuse Nathan Bedford Forrest for the destruction of black lives at Fort Pillow. And of course, Forrest and others continue this. We have to remember, and we don't want to remember. We remember part of history is forgetting, as David Blight would say. We don't want to remember that the vast majority of Klansmen were Confederate veterans. They were fighting that war again. And we honor some of those Confederate veterans by making their participation in the Klan disappear. A very famous person who becomes very famous every July in a small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg, a guy named John B. Gordon. He was a Klan's leader in Georgia, but we don't see him as a terrorist. We see him as a gallant Confederate who rewrote his own story to purge it of his activities with the Klan because he realized that was not something he should be proud of in the historical record, even if he was very proud of it at the time in the political arena. We want to forget those things. So, yes, there aren't that many soldiers, but the fact of the matter is that any support of black rights is going to anger white Southerners. Talk about urban areas. The Memphis riot is an urban riot led by the city authorities of Memphis against African Americans who had just left military service. So we have to start to call things like they are, as opposed to have this romanticized view of, oh, this wasn't that tough. It was pretty tough if you were an African American.
Well, Congress realized it could not trust Andrew Johnson to actually handle the crisis. There's a lot of things he couldn't handle, but in this case, he definitely could not handle the riots, the violence, whatever that may be.
Mhm.
So the burden of enforcement fell squarely on the military. And so, how did General Ulysses S. Grant actually view this institutional dilemma in 1866 when he's caught between a hostile president and an aggressive Congress?
Grant hates politics. He cannot understand why white Southerners do not appreciate the magnitude of their defeat or its consequences. He views Andrew Johnson as giving aid and comfort to those people who fought against the United States and the soldiers he commanded. Uh, and he works with Republicans in Congress rather quietly at first, then more visibly to help construct legislation that puts a lot of Reconstruction under military supervision, including the revival of civil governments and the erection of military commissions to provide colorblind justice for African Americans. He sees this as a continuation of the war, and that this is something that they did fight for. And he himself sees this as part of what he would like to call the fruits of victory, and explains to Sherman in 1868 his decision to run for president is because he believes that the political bickering of the 1860s, and he means Republicans as well as Democrats, will sacrifice what was achieved during the war and will mean that the bloodshed in that war by United States military personnel would have been shed in vain. So I don't think we fully appreciate Grant's commitment to the Reconstruction experiment, a commitment that in some ways echoes Lincoln's sentiments about these things because we want to, again, minimize the rough spots of a very ugly period in American history where democracy is being defined by violent suppression, voter suppression, and force in ways that show the system hasn't quite triumphed as people would like to say in such circumstances.
Let's stick to that point on commitment because what is it that people still really misunderstand when it comes to Grant's commitment toward Black civil rights?
What they don't understand is that there are two things going on here. Grant has an abstract commitment to Black civil rights. Grant's also a political actor. Okay. And since we used to have a belief that Grant didn't understand politics, we tend to minimize that. But Grant understood he could only do so much with political support. So, for example, when there's all this call for martial law in 1871 to suppress the Klan and other organizations, Grant doesn't declare the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus by himself. He demands that Congress pass legislation authorizing him to act that way. That's very different than Lincoln during the American Civil War. He says, I need to have support to do these things. And Grant understands that. In 1875 in Memphis, where there's an effort by white supremacists and Democrats in the state of in the state of Mississippi to overthrow the Republican regime there, Grant says, I realize that our public doesn't care about these things. In fact, one of the documents in the book, Grant's a special message to Congress on January 13th, 1875, talks about how people are really interested in other things. And this, what he says is this so-called blasted land of Christianity and civilization, which is really basically saying, Americans, you're being hypocritical, white Americans. You say you believe in these things, but you let this stuff go. As he puts it, the Colfax miscreants. Colfax massacre was a major slaughter of African Americans in Louisiana in 1873. And Grant says, how can we let this stuff go? And that is, I think, because one thing about Reconstruction is it's not an issue of commitment, it's an issue of rather flimsy construction of enforcement legislation by people who didn't quite get what they were doing. We have a lot of people talking about Grant destroying the Klan, and the Ku Klux Klan as an organization goes down, but white supremacist terrorism remains. So let's not over exaggerate that. We have claims about Grant founding the Department of Justice, but the Department of Justice was not nearly large enough to engage in the mission that it had been charged with of protecting Black Southerners. Also, the congressional legislation for enforcement was narrowly interpreted by a Supreme Court and said, well, if you really want the federal government to do these things, you have to say these things. Well, by that time, the Democratic Party is in control of the House of Representatives, so there's not going to be any change. So there are ways in which the ability to carry Reconstruction out is wounded by Republicans' insufficient efforts to guarantee that it could be carried out. And Grant simply recognizes that the American public will not support a crusade for Black equality. And that's being a pragmatic politician. And that's something Grant's always been chastised for. He's not a political figure. He is a political figure. He thinks it's much more important the Republican Party stay in power in the White House than the Democratic Party. And most people who understood the perspective of Black Americans would have agreed. A Democratic president in 1877, for example, would have been disastrous for Black aspirations. So we tend not to understand that Grant is caught in a true dilemma between what he wants to do and what he realizes is possible. If Grant can be faulted in any sense in this scenario, it's not because of a lack of will so much as it's because of a lack of creativity, of having more expansive notions of federal power. Grant, it's all politics, the art of possible. One of the things about politics is the art of possible. Great political leadership expands what's possible. And that's one thing where Grant generally fell short. It's a very rare quality in a political figure.
There's Yes, when it comes to Ulysses S. Grant, one of the first things that came to mind when I was actually reading his special message to Congress was there was a there's emotion. Typically, you don't get that emotion with Grant, but you definitely could see that there was this. He cared, but I think one of the hard things with Reconstruction is that it's one thing to implement policy to ensure that violence comes to an end, whether that's putting the Klan in prison or creating a justice department or what have you. But it's an entirely a different thing trying to convince, especially these Confederate veterans that we talked about, to completely change their thinking. And I think he certainly could have done more with what he had at his disposal, but at the same time, I think he did a decent job of trying to balance between creating, I'll call it, more anger, but also ensuring that there is some level of security. However, that does eventually kind of come crashing down around him, especially after 1872 in his second term. But was Grant's greatest failure during Reconstruction, was it the failure of policy, leadership, coalition building, or political timing?
I think one of the problems with that question is you're assuming that there was a successful road to Reconstruction. And I'm going to argue that American historians have known at Reconstruction for over a century and a half. Not one single historian has said, let's construct a policy that addresses both the themes of reconciliation and reunion and justice for African Americans. No one has come up with, and come on, historians are great for counterfactuals, and this is what should have been done. They have no workable policy. When we look at Reconstruction today, we tend to minimize the reconciliationist aspect of that policy, that it was a war for reunion, not a war to destroy the South. It was a war to destroy the Confederacy, but not the South, a war to bring the country back together. And Grant all the time sought out white Southerners who we believe were acting in good faith in this regard. John Singleton Mosby and James Longstreet, for example. So when we say Grant could have done these things, first of all, is there a plausible historical figure who could have done a better job than Grant as President of the United States? Is there a plausible historical figure who would have retained as much public support? Grant was much more popular than his party. Grant and other Republicans understood that there was actually a fairly limited support for Black suffrage and Black equality in the North. And they understood that because in the 1860s, Northern states held referendum to have Black suffrage incorporated in the state constitutions, and those referendums were defeated. So he also realizes that there's only so much political capital he can draw upon. It's never quite so strong as he would have desired, or that anybody, frankly, who is interested in Black equality and the end to white supremacist terrorist violence would have wanted. The support's not there. And that's why it's not Grant's failure in a way, it's America's failure. And again, that's why you don't want to teach that in an American history course, because Americans failing to realize their commitment to their principles is not a popular theme in American history courses or American history texts or the History Channel or anything else. We don't want to hear that. And we see that right now in the attitude of certain elements in American society towards the teaching American history. We want a positive, triumphant, victorious view of American history that overlooks shortcomings, betrayals, and basically failures. We don't want to talk about that because it makes us feel bad. And people think history should make you feel good. History's purpose is to make you understand what happened, not to necessarily make you feel good.
Well, one theme that really runs throughout this book is that Americans often use the same words: liberty, equality, citizenship, justice, but meant very, very different things by them. So, how important is it for readers to actually understand that Reconstruction was fundamentally a debate over competing definitions of freedom?
Well, I mean, that's true of all of American history. I mean, we look at the coming of the American Civil War, how people justified freedom, liberty, equality. You could use that language to justify secession, and you could use that language to justify resistance to secession. So American politics has always been conditioned by a common vocabulary, even if people mean very different things by those words. They have to reconcile what they believe by the use of those words, those terms, those what we call cluster concepts. And they may mean different things to different people. And so Reconstruction becomes a refounding of the American promise, an incomplete refounding. And one could argue that that incomplete refounding continues down to the movement for women's suffrage, for example. It also comes down in terms of failure to the treatment of Native Americans and trying to extinguish their cultures through the reservation system, which Grant endorsed because he believed in an assimilationist view that Native Americans could become Americans, but they would have to be Christianized and civilized. And that, of course, involves what many critics would call cultural genocide. So we have to understand the promise of America is up in the air in the 1870s what really people are willing to commit to. And they're not willing to commit towards women's rights, the majority of white Americans. They're not willing to commit to the protection of Black rights. They're not willing to fully realize the promise of American values and their broad definition, an all encompassing definition of those terms. They still want to narrow them down. And they use federalism as a way to do that and say, well, we can't deal with those things. That's up for the states. Women's suffrage, after all, takes off at a state level before it takes off at a national level.
If you could pinpoint a single event between 1865 and 1877 is the greatest potential to possibly alter Reconstruction's outcome, what would that possibly be, if there is any?
There's not an event that would have happened. The thing that would have happened would have been the death of Andrew Johnson. Uh, People talk about all the promise of Reconstruction and what could have been done in terms of land redistribution and more assertive federal government. By the time Grant becomes president in 1869, the die is already cast. The Reconstruction Acts are already part of things. States have been readmitted into the Union. He's not working with the same openness of opportunity that Johnson operated with in 1865. So if you eliminate Johnson, then you have a different story. And that's why accepting Andrew Johnson as his running mate was Abraham Lincoln's biggest mistake. And Lincoln ought to be held accountable for that. And no one should tell me, well, Lincoln didn't know he was going to get shot. Abraham Lincoln knew his life was in peril during the American Civil War. He had firsthand experience of this. So don't tell me he didn't think that he couldn't, that he was invulnerable. He exposed himself. Fort Stevens in July 1864, he exposed himself to enemy fire. He was aware of assassination attempts. Assault on the White House carriage, for example, that hurt his wife. I mean, this is well known. So Lincoln knew there was a possibility that he could be killed. And if you pick somebody as your potential successor who does not share your vision, and your values, you're taking a great risk on the American future. And Lincoln did that. And the selection of Andrew Johnson basically to my mind makes no sense is all this talk about is reaching out to Southerners don't vote in the United States election of 1864 by and large. They belong to the Confederacy. Andrew Johnson is a controversial war Democratic figure. He's not necessarily a unifier. If you were reaching across the aisle to the other party, there were better people to pick. Um, Johnson was a divisive individual whose unionism during secession crisis in the early years of the war is admirable, but he was not the kind of person to give you additional votes on the ticket. So, you can go back to, you don't have to eliminate Johnson. You just don't have to have him in the vice presidential chair as of April 14th, 1865.
So I have to ask because I'm now curious. Who do you think Lincoln should have had as his vice president?
He could have maintained Hannibal Hamlin, who was a supportive individual. If he wanted somebody who would attract war Democrats and who had a commitment to black equality, he could have picked Benjamin Butler. There were people, and since he valued Butler's political clout and frankly understood Butler was not a capable military commander, Butler would not have been a horrific choice. And I'm sure that statement's going to get a lot of attraction. But I think on April 15th, 1865, if I'm an African American and I'm given the choice between Ben Butler and Andrew Johnson as president, I'm going to take Ben Butler.
Okay.
There's
I
your
think that
headline.
I think that would work. There's not much I could probably say to that or even disagree with. So a lot of counterfactuals are people like to throw counterfactuals out or they like to do a lot of what if questions. And, I don't know how you personally feel about them, but there is one that I hear a lot. Now, I tend to not go along with this, but I often hear that, if Abraham Lincoln had lived, had he not been assassinated, things would have been great. So let me ask the question, how much of a difference would Abraham Lincoln's survival have made?
All right. I'm on record as saying that basically counterfactual questions are an exercise in your own imagination and your preferences. Given that caveat, I would say that Lincoln would not have acted in the extreme ways that Andrew Johnson did, to the point that Reconstruction legislation became as much an effort to handcuff Andrew Johnson as it did to reconstruct the South. So I think Lincoln would have favored a more gradual approach to things. People might have appreciated, might not have. The real question is where the white South would have been cooperative in any way whatsoever with a more gradual acceptance of black equality, such as Lincoln's last public speech, in which he speculates about the possibility of extending the right of suffrage to black veterans and those who can pass the literacy test. So there's some sympathy for black equality in Lincoln that there isn't in Johnson. But there's not a lot of evidence that Lincoln could have presided over the kind of reconstruction that some people in the 1960s really wanted, not the 1860s, but as well as the 1960s. Historians talked about the revolutionary change of land redistribution and confiscation and things like that. Lincoln is kind of slow on that. He's not a revolutionary leader. And the question of land confiscation or redistribution is truly a counterfactual question because it's not going to happen while Andrew Johnson's president.
Well, as we start to wrap up here, there's one final question that I have for you, and it goes back to what we talked about earlier. That look, I think you're exactly right that Reconstruction is not something that people really enjoy teaching about, talking about. I think you're exactly right. People look for history that make them feel good. So, based upon the failures of Reconstruction, what do you think America should take away from the lessons of it?
You have to be willing to dig in and work hard to achieve lasting social change. Lasting social change does not come quickly or easily, and it requires a sustained commitment, which white Northerners were not willing to exhibit during Reconstruction. Historians have talked about the Confederacy collapsing because of lack of will, but Confederate will is one issue. Southern white will to preserving white supremacy was much stronger than the will for Confederate independence, whereas the will of white Northerners to preserve Black rights and Black equality was far less than the will to fight to preserve the Union. And so then, contest and wills, the white South prevailed. Northern will was not what it needed to be. To have the kind of change you want is going to cost, and it's going to require a lot of energy and commitment. We're not like that as a country. You could see that, for example, in the war in Iraq in 2003, that, oh, we're going to go in there, overthrow a regime, and then we're going to leave. And why aren't we out of there? Well, because what we're doing an exercise in nation building, and to some extent, Reconstruction is an exercise in nation building, really takes a lot of energy and commitment and determination, and that's not there. It wasn't there in the early 21st century. It wasn't there in the mid 19th century.
Well, again, we have Brooks Simpson with us today. If you are interested in picking up his book, Reconstruction, you can buy it on Amazon or from Library of America. Thank you again for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on, Dr. Simpson. And remember, if you have a fix for history, check us out at History Fix, where you can stream videos about the American Revolution to World War II and much, much more. Sign up today to start your trial now. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you all next Saturday.